Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Cairo, late June 2022. A television presenter steps out of a private club on the edge of the city, says she'll be 10 minutes, and walks into the heat with her phone dimmed against the sun. One text goes out, one call is missed, then the handset stops moving on the network. In cases like this, you start with time. Time fixes what stories try to bend. Her name is Shaima Gamal, a public figure with a set call schedule and people who notice when she is even minutes late. Within hours, colleagues escalate from unanswered messages to a formal endangered missing report. The initial review is clinical. Last seen window, direction of travel toward Giza, a narrow cluster of pings before silence. No confirmed crime scene yet. That matters. The difference between a disappearance and a homicide early on is one hard location. Investigators do what seasoned teams always do. They lock the clock on her phone records, pull the access logs, and reconcile them with nearby cameras. The first pass builds a corridor out of Cairo toward Betrayal. Inside that corridor, a second vehicle appears briefly near the pickup point with partially obscured plates. It could mean nothing. It could mean everything. At this stage, nothing is assumed. The watchword is correlation. Does the signal path align with a visible route, and do the intervals make sense for the distances involved? Privately, those closest to Shaima describe a routine that makes voluntary absence unlikely. Work segments left uncovered, calls she never misses, a public role that doesn't allow unannounced breaks. That context doesn't prove a crime. It does justify urgency. In towns like this, murders don't just take lives, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. The task is to separate noise from signal without dragging the audience through speculation. We will stay with what is documented. And there's a reason veteran investigators speak in short sentences when a case is fresh. The data align too cleanly, sometimes that was the problem. A clean line can be a controlled line. So the team widens the search, builds a map of dwell times at key intersections, and flags any stop long enough to offload a person or a phone. They move fast because fast preserves evidence. They move quiet because quiet preserves options. We will follow this case the way it was built. Timeline, evidence, legal status. One scene when it is confirmed. One timeline anchored by clocks, cameras, and custody logs. One ending, no alternate paths. If you were the case agent with only two final pings and a road that leads south, which camera would you pull first? The first 24 hours are for clocks and cameras. Investigators take the 10-minute promise from the venue door and push it against everything that can carry a timestamp. Cell site activity, license plate hits, intersection feeds, merchant DVRs, and highway control rooms. The goal is not narrative, it's alignment. If the phone's last activity narrows to a short window, the roadway footage should show a vehicle leaving when that window closes. If it doesn't, the window is false or something was moved. They start with the handset records tied to Shaima Gamal. The carrier returns a clean sequence, outgoing text, missed call, then a short burst of signaling as the device hands off toward the southwest corridor. After that, nothing. The team locks those event times, converts them to a single time base, and then standardizes every camera they touch to that same clock. This matters. A 5-minute drift on a private DVR can make two cars look like one, or a decoy look like the target. Venue cameras show her departing into afternoon glare. Outside, a curb lane view picks up traffic rolling toward Giza. Investigators track vehicles whose departure coincides with the phone's last network behavior. One sedan idles near the pickup zone with partially obscured plates. Its exit timestamp lives inside the vanish window. No assumptions are made. The car is tagged, not accused, and added to a working list the team will try to either match or eliminate down the road. They expand the ring. Arterial cameras feed into a simple path analysis, time between intersections versus the distance a reasonable driver would cover. Gaps are flagged. If a car leaves the venue at 14:36 and appears 2 intersections away at 14:50, the dwell between those points needs explaining. Dwell can mean a normal stop, a turn off the grid, or a place where a device is powered down. The data here is suggestive, not conclusive. You hold it lightly until something firmer arrives. Call detail records from known contacts are checked for overlap with the vanish window. No pattern jumps out, no burst of ringing traffic that would indicate a live back and forth while she was in motion. That absence is useful. Silence narrows choices. If no real-time chatter exists, then either she traveled with someone she already trusted enough to go quiet, or she had no chance to make a call. Both are operational theories, not conclusions. Private cameras along the corridor are harder. Small shops run DVRs with inconsistent settings. Investigators document which systems have auto-overwrite, which keep a 30-day buffer, and which require a manual export. A control sheet lists each camera's drift relative to the master clock and notes whether the view covers lanes leading toward Betrayal. One gas station angle is messy but serviceable. Reflections in its glass panels produce a secondary glimpse of the roadway that helps confirm the direction of travel. That reflection doesn't change what happened. It just makes the path more certain. The sedan with the obscured plates reappears twice. Each time, the timing lines up with realistic driving speeds from the venue to the next camera. No reckless jumps, no impossible shortcuts. The path is ordinary in a way that raises a professional question. Was it chosen because it leaves fewer reliable cameras, or because it looks like every other car going home? The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Human context is kept in view without overshadowing the evidence. Colleagues report missed obligations that would normally trigger a call-in from producers. Family flags habits that don't fit a voluntary absence. Those details justify the tempo of the search, but they don't steer it. The case stays on clocks, not feelings. Investigators resist the urge to label any car the car until they can show entry, transit, and exit along the same track with gaps explained and alternatives eliminated. By the end of this pass, the map is tighter. The corridor into Giza is confirmed. Movement along lanes that feed toward Betrayal is plausible and supported by time-matched footage. The working list of vehicles is shorter. The sedan with partial plates remains on it. No suspect is named. No charges are implied. The value here is directional, a cleaner path south and a set of times that, if combined with the right tip, can ground a lawful, targeted search. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. The job is to find one place where that tear began. The corridor work gave investigators direction. A credible tip gave them a place. With clocks synchronized and a narrow map pointing south, a male associate came forward and identified a tract outside Abu Sir, Betrayal. The disclosure was detailed enough to justify a targeted search under proper authority. Teams moved at night to preserve the site, limit traffic, and control lighting. The shift from endangered missing to scene protection was immediate. Perimeter tape, entry log, and a clean path in and out. They treated the ground like a ledger. A forensic mapper laid a grid over the most disturbed section, marking square by square. Fresh soil sat looser than the surrounding pack. Moisture didn't match the surface, and the compaction layer showed recent disruption. Tool scoring was visible in the walls of a shallow pit, parallel lines that suggested a digging edge, not natural erosion. Several squares tested positive for volatile compounds consistent with chemical application. The air near the disturbance carried an acrid note. These observations didn't assign motive. They documented method. Excavation followed a routine sequence. Photographs first, wide to tight, with scale markers placed and verified against the scene log. Soil was removed in thin lifts, each bag labeled by grid square and depth. Items from the upper layer, plant matter, stray plastic, were cataloged but treated as environmental noise until shown otherwise. Deeper in, fabric fragments and traces consistent with human presence appeared in the same grid run. No assumptions were written into the record. The language stayed neutral, consistent with, located within, retained for analysis. At depth, human remains were recovered. The team kept the camera rolling as proof of sequence. There was no commentary, just timestamps and the sound of measured work. Identifying features and items in proximity were photographed in place and then secured. Given open allegations later about theft of jewelry and a phone, the absence of obvious valuables at the site was noted without inference. Formal identification would be deferred to the medical examiner. Any visual consistency with Shaima Gamal, clothing, size, hair, was treated as preliminary and labeled that way. The scene was tight for a reason. No officer crossed the tape without logging in. Every bag carried an evidence number and the initials of the technician who sealed it. A separate chain of custody log recorded what left the ground and who took possession. That discipline isn't a formality. It's how a case survives court. When the public hears chain of custody, it can sound abstract. Here, it was the backbone. Each sample labeled, each handoff tracked, each container closed with a tamper-evident seal. Beyond the primary trench, a smaller sweep confirmed there were no secondary dig points. The vehicle approach was documented. Tire compression in soft soil near the access lane, not enough tread detail to make a match, but enough to mark the traffic path in and out. Footwear impressions were partial and degraded. They were cast anyway. Even if they never anchored to a specific shoe, they told a simple story. This ground had been worked recently by more than one person, with tools. The classification changed the moment the remains surfaced. The file was no longer a missing person inquiry. It was a homicide anchored to one verified location, a farm plot at Abu Sur. Notifications followed protocol. Outbound messaging was restrained until next of kin could be reached and until the medical examiner could confirm identity. The priority on scene stayed the same. Preserve what could speak later: soil chemistry, fabric layers, insect activity, and any trace that might link to a time window already defined by the cell site data. A short human note belongs here, not to dramatize the moment, but to frame its weight. Families in cases like this want certainty, even when the answer hurts. A careful recovery is part of that duty. It delivers a timeline that can be tested and a record that can be defended. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes. They break routines and relationships far beyond a single day. The work on that ground was the beginning of legal accountability, not the end of grief. With the site secure, the team transitioned to the next steps. Transfer of remains under seal to the medical examiner, environmental samples to the lab, and scene notes to the case agent. The why would be argued later. The how was taking shape: digging tool marks, a controlled burial, and signs of a chemical agent applied to the disturbed earth. Those findings would matter in court when the state had to prove intent. For now, they stood as facts tied to a place and a time. One question for you as we move forward: if you were building this case, which lab analysis would you prioritize first? Soil chemistry to identify the agent used at the scene, or entomological data to refine time of burial? Transport began the same night the recovery ended. The remains left the farm at Abu Sur under seal, escorted, with a custody log that listed every hand that touched the stretcher. At the medical examiner's facility, the seal numbers were read aloud, photographed, and matched to the scene log before the first glove snapped on. This is how you keep a case clean when it moves from soil to stainless steel. Identification came first. Distinguishing features, dental comparison, and items preserved from the scene allowed the examiner to confirm the victim as Shaima Gamal. That confirmation changed how the file was labeled, not how the work was done. The next steps were mechanical. Document injuries, document any chemical agent present, and build a time of death window that could be tested against the phone and camera timeline established earlier. External examination recorded patterned abrasions and blunt force trauma consistent with impact before burial. A ballistic pathway was documented and photographed with track, entry, and associated tissue disruption marked for later testimony. The examiner avoided language that implies motive. The report stuck to sequence. Injury: A precedes injury. B, when hemorrhage patterns show A was delivered while circulation still had pressure. The autopsy notes used that standard, not guesswork. Traces from hair, fabric, and skin swabs were reserved for chemistry. Soil lifted from beneath and around the body was analyzed against control samples taken several meters away at the farm. The soil under and above the remains showed a different chemical profile than the undisturbed ground. That difference supported what was already observed by the scene team. A chemical agent had been applied in the disturbed area. The report did not speculate why. It established that the agent was present and at what approximate concentration when sampled. Time of death matters because it either fits the corridor or it doesn't. Entomology offered an initial bracket based on insect colonization stages. That bracket was cross-checked with temperature records and burial depth. The medical examiner then compared internal decomposition markers with the outdoor conditions documented in the scene photos. The result was a window that sat inside late June 2022, close to the last active handset window from earlier. When that happens, when autopsy timing and network timing converge, investigators press harder on anyone who controlled access to the victim inside that bracket. No evidence report stands alone. The body was screened for defensive injuries, restraint artifacts, and toxicology that might indicate incapacitation. Defensive marks were limited and not definitive. Toxicology did not show a sedative pattern strong enough to explain silence by itself. That absence is useful. When chemistry can't carry the reason for quiet, you look harder at control, time, movement, and opportunity. The narrative voice for a case like this stays plain. The body shows assault, a ballistic injury, and post-incident burial with a chemical application to the surrounding soil. Chain of custody language in the autopsy file mirrored the scene log. Each sample, blood, tissue, swab, soil, had a label that matched the photograph taken at the moment of collection. Each transfer to the laboratory had a signature and a time. That precision sounds tedious until court day, when a defense challenges how a bag was sealed or who touched a slide. In this file, those questions would meet a paper trail that answered itself. Families often ask whether the victim suffered. The examiner's role is not to console, it is to be exact. The report described injuries in order and stated which were fatal, which could have been survived with immediate care, and which were inflicted after death. The language helps prosecutors without turning the document into an argument. It also helps the family understand what happened without forcing them to carry speculation. The autopsy's alignment with the field work at the farm was notable. Tool marks in the trench walls showed a deliberate dig, not a collapse. Chemicals in the soil were real, not imagined. The ballistic injury had a direction that fit a face-to-face assault better than a distant strike. Those are building blocks. They do not identify a person. They do frame what a truthful account must include if one is offered later. How contact was made, how control was maintained, how a shot was delivered, and how burial was executed. The report moved from the examiner's office to the investigative team with a cover memo that highlighted the timing window and the key forensic points in neutral terms. That allowed detectives to compare the findings against alibis, travel records, and any statement already collected. If someone's reported location sits outside the corridor during the injury window, you push that lead down the list. If it sits inside the corridor with gaps, you move it up. There's a quiet responsibility in this part of the process. The work speaks for someone who cannot. Precision is a form of respect. The file now carried facts that could not be replaced with rumor. The identity of the victim, the nature of the assault, a ballistic injury that ended a life, and a burial treated with a chemical agent. The next turn would not be about whether a crime occurred. It would be about who planned it, who carried it out, and who helped hide it. Before we leave this room, a practical question to consider. Given this autopsy in soil chemistry, would you prioritize interviewing contacts who were inside the time window or running a comparative analysis on tools recovered from properties linked to those contacts? Once the autopsy bracket lined up with late June, detectives turned to conduct who acted in ways that fit the window and who didn't. The first pass was simple chronology: who contacted authorities, when the calls were made, and how those times compared to the moment the phone went dark. Delays were measured in hours, not days, yet they stood out against Shaima Gamal's routine. Producers expected confirmations. Friends expected quick replies. The absence didn't prove intent, but it forced a closer read of anyone with access during that narrow span. They built a movement chart for the key hours. Reported whereabouts were plotted against the synchronized camera grid established in the corridor work. Where a person said they were became less important than whether an image or a transaction showed them there. Two gaps emerged, brief, but at moments that mattered. Neither gap alone could carry the case. Together they justified deeper questions. A clean alibi explains the minutes. A weak one explains the feeling. Investigators wanted the minutes. Phone behavior around the victim was conservative, little chatter in the bracket. That silence trimmed the list of unknown contacts and threw weight back onto proximity. Family, colleagues, and anyone whose relationship could place them with her without raising suspicion. Detectives asked for devices voluntarily first, then by order when required. A handset that was left at home or powered off during the bracket was treated like a scene of its own. Logs pulled, location histories checked, and recent resets noted. A factory reset can be nothing. It can also be a clock that chimes exactly when you need it not to. Statements were taken quietly and in sequence. The questions never changed. When did you last see her? What was said? Where did you go next? Who can place you there? Investigators listened less for emotion than for structure. How a story fixes time and place, how it handles the 10-minute promise, and whether it accounts for the southbound corridor. One version relied on generalities where specifics were easy to provide. That didn't convict anyone. It did move that witness higher on the follow-up list. Financial crumbs were checked against the bracket. There was no large cash withdrawal to suggest a sudden trip and no card activity by the victim after the vanish window. The file noted later, as a separate legal matter, that property tied to her, jewelry and a phone, would become part of a theft count in court. Here in the behavior phase, those entries served a narrower point. Items expected with the victim were not recovered with her and did not transact in the hours after she went silent. Detectives also reviewed the reporting pathway, who phoned the police and who phoned friends first. A rapid call to family with a slower call to authorities isn't unusual. A slow call to both, set against a tight autopsy window, draws attention. The team avoided loaded language and worked the times. If a message went out at 1812 and the first official report arrived much later without clear reason, that delay became a documented fact. A fact like that can be explained, but it cannot be erased. People close to the case often want certainty now. The work doesn't allow it. What it allows is pressure. Each contradiction generates a request: devices, travel records, third-party confirmations. Investigators asked for tool access histories and property entries that could connect a person to implements consistent with the trench marks at the farm. They did this without naming anyone publicly or making leaps the evidence could not carry. The aim was a clean bridge from behavior to mechanics, who had time, who had means, and who had reason, as alleged later in court. There's value in saying this plainly. Attention on a person of interest is not a verdict. It's a step that lets the next piece of evidence land where it belongs. And if you're watching this case with us, consider a focused question as we turn the page. Given a tight death window in a single farm scene, do you prioritize the interview whose story floats on generalities, or the warrant that tests whether tools in that person's orbit match the trench we documented? Interviews began with the same discipline as the dig. Detectives worked the list built from access, timing, and proximity, taking statements separately and in order. Each session opened with simple anchors: when, where, who can verify, then moved to the 10-minute promise, the southbound corridor, and the hours bracketed by autopsy. The goal wasn't to provoke, it was to map words onto clocks and soil. One witness, a male associate already known to the file, offered more than travel memories. He described a location outside Abu Sur, a farm plot reachable by the same lanes the camera grid captured. He referenced digging, a rapid burial, and the use of a chemical agent to cover the disturbed area. Those details were not shared publicly. They matched the trench scoring and soil profile recorded at the scene. When a statement anticipates facts known only to investigators, you test it hard. Detectives pressed for sequence: contact, movement, control, assault, concealment. The order he described aligned with what the medical examiner had already put in writing. With that alignment on record, the file moved to the point where names enter the narrative. The spouse, Ayman Abdel Fattah Hagag, a senior jurist, was identified in the investigation. A second man, Hussein El Garabli, was identified as an associate. Interviews and investigative statements outlined a plan to lure Shema Gamal to the farm, an assault that included blunt force and a gunshot, and a burial treated with a chemical agent. The mechanics tracked: one scene, one set of injuries, one timeline embedded in late June 2022. Charges followed through the public prosecution, and detention orders secured the defendants while the case advanced. The language in the paperwork stayed cautious. Prosecutors alleged premeditation. Investigators documented corroboration. That separation matters. A case built on confession alone is soft. A case where a confession sits on top of trench marks, chemistry, and a ballistic path is different. Each asserted action had a companion fact: a dig where the grid said ground was cut, a chemical residue where the instrument said the profile changed, a fatal track where the report mapped entry and disruption. The statement did not create the evidence. It sat down next to it. Alibi claims were retested with the new admissions in mind. Where earlier answers leaned on generalities, the follow-up demanded minutes: exact departure times, exact intersections, exact reasons for silence during the key bracket. Device histories seized under authority were compared to the movement described in the interviews. Resets and gaps that once lived in the curious column moved to probative when the route to Abu Sur and the burial timeline stayed intact under questioning. Investigators kept one standard from the first night: chain of custody for words as strict as for objects. Each interview had a start time, an end time, a list of present officers, and an audio or video record where policy allowed. Summaries were drafted, reviewed, and tied to the same master clock used for cameras and scene logs. That sounds procedural because it is. A case like this attracts scrutiny. An intact procedure is how you carry the weight. The referral package, statements, autopsy, soil analysis, timeline exhibits, was prepared with a clear spine: disappearance at a venue on Cairo's outskirts, a corridor into Giza, a farm in Badrashin, and a single trench that converted a missing person inquiry into homicide. The defendants named in the file were held for trial on charges that reflected intent and joint participation. No alternative scenes were introduced, no second endings were implied. The bridge from behavior to mechanics was now a roadway with mile markers. There's a quiet reality when a case reaches this point. Families want the why, and communities want the who. The file can only promise what and when until a court rules. Precision remains a form of respect. The statements now in evidence did not float free. They locked into the clocks, the chemistry, and the wound path. That is how a story stops being a story and becomes a record. One practical question as we move forward: when a statement matches protected details from the scene, do you prioritize additional corroboration from independent lab work, or do you move first to secure warrants on properties and vehicles linked to the named parties? Court is where speculation dies. The file that began with a 10-minute errand and a southbound corridor arrived in a Giza criminal courtroom as a tight package. One scene at the farm in Abu Sur, one late June 2022 timeline, one victim, Shaima Gamal, and statements that matched trench marks, soil chemistry, and a ballistic track. Prosecutors led with sequence, not adjectives: lure, assault, gunshot, burial, chemical application. Each term pointed to an exhibit number. The panel heard how the handset window closed, how cameras confirmed movement toward Badrashin, and how the autopsy's time of death bracket sat inside that same window. Forensic technicians walked the court through the dig in square meters and centimeters: disturbed soil, cut edges consistent with tools, volatile compounds sampled and preserved, chain of custody intact from ground to lab. The medical examiner explained injury order and lethality, keeping to the discipline of physiology: which wounds bled under pressure, which findings supported a face-to-face shot, which changes aligned with burial depth and temperature. The purpose was simple: show that mechanics and timing converged at a single place. Investigative statements were introduced alongside the physical record. The man identified as Hussein El Garibli acknowledged the farm, the digging, and the effort to hide the site. The spouse, Ayman Abdel Fattah Hagag, stood as the principal defendant. The prosecution framed motive as reputational pressure and threatened exposure. They labeled it an allegation and tied it to behavior before and after the bracket. The strength of their case didn't depend on why, it rested on how: access, opportunity, and a set of actions that left measurable traces in dirt, fabric, and tissue. Defense counsel pushed where the file had seams. They questioned whether a confession could stand without coercion, whether chemistry could prove intent rather than panic, and whether any camera captured the moment of violence itself. They emphasized the absence of sedative levels on toxicology and suggested alternative sequences. The bench asked for clarity on links: which specific samples tied which defendant to which act. The state answered with custody logs and the alignment no fiction can counterfeit, protected details in a statement that predated public release, and scene findings that did not move when pressed. In Egypt's capital cases, the court seeks the Grand Mufti's opinion before final sentence. That referral is procedural, not determinative. It affirms gravity and ensures form. After consultation, the Giza Criminal Court issued judgment on September 11, 2022. Death sentences for Ayman Abdel Fattah Hagag and Hussein El Garibli, along with short custodial terms tied to theft of the victim's property. The decision tracked the spine you followed with us: a disappearance anchored by clocks, a farm scene anchored by tools and chemistry, a homicide anchored by autopsy and statements that sat down next to the facts rather than asking the facts to bend. For families, a verdict is closure only on paper. The law still has one more hill to climb. In systems like this, finality comes from a court that reviews law and procedure rather than refighting evidence. That's the next door in this story. Before we walk through it, hold the essentials steady. One scene, one timeline, one record that survived challenge. If you were building the appellate brief, which pillar would you present first to resist reversal? Chain of custody integrity or the statement to scene concordance? Appeals in this system don't retry facts. They test whether the trial followed the law. The record that left the Giza criminal court, one scene at the farm in Abu Sur, one late June 2022 timeline, one victim, moved to the Court of Cassation with a narrow brief, examined procedure, charge framing, admissibility, and the integrity of how exhibits and statements were received. The filings challenged voluntariness, chain of custody handling, and whether the court weighed motive beyond its probative value. The file answered with logs, timestamps, and rulings already preserved in the transcript. Nothing new was invented. The question was compliance, not reinvention. On review, cassation upheld the convictions and death sentences. In practical terms, that ruling closed the legal door. The trial court's findings stood, the evidentiary path remained intact, and the defendant's remedies in ordinary channels were exhausted. What began with a 10-minute errand and a southbound corridor ended as a final judgment. No alternate endings, no parallel narrative. For the family of Shaima Gamal, it meant the system had finished speaking on the record. Administrative steps followed outside the spotlight. Media attention shifted, as it often does when cases leave the front page and enter the slow parts of criminal justice. Inside the documents, though, the spine you've tracked stayed the same farm, the same trench, the same late June bracket supported by autopsy, the same pair of defendants the prosecution tied to planning, assault, burial, and concealment. Finality lives in that redundancy, separate mechanisms pointing to the same conclusion without needing to repeat the story beats you heard before. In August 2025, local reporting stated that the death sentences were carried out for Ayman Abdel Fattah Haggag and Hussein El Garibli. Execution notices in this jurisdiction are spare, and public detail is limited by design. That economy can feel unsatisfying to audiences used to long press conferences, but it fits the law's tone at the end. The record closes where the court says it closes. For families, it is not relief, it is certainty. For communities, it is a message about how evidence, phones, cameras, trench grids, chemistry, and sworn statements can build a case that survives challenge. A measured note belongs here. True crime work has value only when it refuses to speculate after the verdict. The purpose of retelling is not to reopen final judgments, it's to understand how investigators built a file that could withstand scrutiny and how a court separated allegation from proof. In towns like Badrashin, the ripples of a homicide do not stop at a farm fence. Colleagues, neighbors, and viewers who never met the victim still live with the knowledge that violence hid in plain sight. Precision honors that reality. So does restraint. This is the endpoint of one record and the start of a larger conversation. If you care about prevention, you look upstream. Reporting pathways that move faster, training that improves digital triage in the first hours, and public awareness that encourages bystanders to share small details sooner. License digits, dwell times, the odd stop that didn't fit traffic. Those fragments reduce guesswork. They shorten searches. They give families answers that don't take years. One last question to carry forward. If you could fix a single weak link exposed by this case, early reporting delays, patchy private CCTV standards, or the way device data is preserved, where would you start and why? I'm leaving you with this. Cases don't break on hunches. They break on timestamps, courage, and people who speak up early. If something feels off, document it, report it, and protect the chain. Your small detail could save a life. As neighbors and citizens, we owe each other vigilance and compassion in equal measure. What did this case teach you about prevention? Where are you watching from? If this story moved you, or if it missed the mark, tell me why in the comments. And if you want more hard human true crime done with respect, hit subscribe and stay with the channel for the next investigation.